We'll move to that now. The troop surge, as you know, has been hailed by certainly the Bush administration, many supporters, John McCain as well, running for president, as the significant reason behind the decline in violence in Iraq. How much of the decline in violence do you attribute to the surge?
Very little, if anything. First of all, if masses of troops were the answer, in other words, pouring more Christian Europeans in U.S. or British uniform into Iraq, then Vietnam today would be the 51st state, because that was our solution in Vietnam, and it failed miserably. If you look at the timetable for the arrival of the so-called surge troops, almost half of them didn't even arrive on the ground until June. And the precipitous drop-off in casualties actually began in June, about the time the so-called surge troops were arriving. And this is because General Petraeus urged his commanders to begin cutting deals with the Sunni Arab insurgents to buy them off, to effectively pay the sheikhs millions of dollars, while they in turn turn around and pay their subordinates. It was a very uncomfortable situation, by the way, for thousands and thousands of U.S. troops on the ground who'd been fighting these people, who suddenly had to stand by while they were being paid off under circumstances that were very, very difficult. And it is still difficult. We have lots of evidence that the money is being taken. Some of it is being used, obviously, for the wrong purposes. Some are buying armaments with it that they're not supposed to have. Quite frankly, we don't have much control over really what happens to the money once it passes out of our hands into the hands of the former insurgents. Okay, so you're not sold on the surge. You think the passing out of the money has more to do with it. I wonder as well if you can gauge the effectiveness of this. The ethno-sectarian cleansing in Baghdad and central Iraq, which is now, I guess, almost completely done. How much of a factor is that in the reduction of violence? Well, it's a huge factor. Baghdad, as you know, was previously more than 50% Sunni. Today it's less than 25% Sunni and more than 75% Shiite. These neighborhoods are now literally fortresses. They are walled off and they are guarded by their respective militias. So this has certainly reduced violence. And once the area becomes sectarian pure, rather, you begin to see businesses open and shops open, and people are willing to go out on the streets. This is nothing new. We've seen this off and on, certainly since 2004. The point is, it's an illusion if one takes from this picture right now the notion that there is real stability. And then when you look at the numbers of Americans killed or wounded, in January we had 40 killed and over 200 wounded. That's about 50% of where we were over the previous 12 months. And most of that can be attributed to the status quo in Anbar province. And actually speaking, since December, the casualties have been inching upwards. So I'm very uncomfortable. The people I talk to who are on the ground over there are not comfortable. No one is deluded by the current status quo who is in uniform. No one trusts any of these Arabs, to be perfectly blunt, and the Arabs don't trust us. It's a very uncomfortable situation. Tell me about Turkey. Tell me how you would think the fact that the Turkish have now sent troops into northern Iraq, into the Kurdish areas, how that's affecting the overall security story in the country. Well, to put it bluntly, Turkish military intervention of any kind is, in strategic terms, a game-changing event for everybody in the region. We've heard lots of discussions about Iran and the supposed threat that Iran poses to the region. Let's keep something in mind. There is only one Muslim country in that part of the world today that can project any military power successfully over its borders. That country is Turkey. The Turkish military establishment is the largest in NATO. It's extraordinarily well trained, very competently led. And there has been a revival of sorts of Islam, not so much in terms of religious fanaticism, but in a cultural sense. The Turks over the last several years have been rediscovering their roots, their Ottoman past. It's a nationalist revival. So what is happening right now with the Kurds is bound up with these issues inside Turkey. The Turks, if they go in a massive way, will completely change the situation. And the fear that I and many others have, and I've worked with the Turkish military, and I have enormous respect for it, and I hold the Turks in very high esteem, is that we will be drawn into this conflict between the Kurds and the Turks. And that would be a catastrophe, because the Turks would fight. Our position in Turkey in terms of popularity is at an all-time low, as I'm sure you're aware. So the bottom line is the Turks have legitimate security concerns. They really didn't want us to intervene in Iraq to begin with. And if we were the recipients of the kinds of blatant military assaults into the United States from our neighbors to the south or the north, I can guarantee you that the U.S. military would be mobilized and sent in very quickly. So Turks' concerns are quite legitimate and should be treated as such.
Colonel, I know you're not in the public opinion surveying business, but I do want to get your sense, since you know the area so well, of whether you think the majority of Iraqis actually want to keep their country together as one country. What's your sense?
Well, you know, that's a very important question, and I do talk to an awful lot of people on the ground over there. I try to talk to as many Arabs as I can, and people in the region from Cairo to the Red Sea and across to the Indian Ocean, and try to get some sense of that. My view is that you've got to look at Iraq as fundamentally Muslim Arab in the center and the south, and then Kurdish in the north. Kurdistan is a de facto independent state. I think we really need to understand that. So let's just remove the Kurds from the equation, if you will, and talk exclusively about the Muslim Arabs, the few Turkomans and Yazidis that are still in the country. I think, based upon what I'm hearing, that part of the struggle inside the country right now is not just Sunni versus Shia. It's really between those who support the division of the country, who, by the way, are profiting from the U.S. military presence, which is trying to capitalize on this division, and those who want to hold Arab Iraq together. Muqtada al-Sadr, for instance, whatever else he may be, is still an Arab nationalist, and the Sunnis know this. And there are many Sunni Arabs who are also Arab nationalists. So if I were to break it down, I would say that if you asked the Arabs collectively, probably 80% would argue that Muslim Arab Iraq needs to be kept together, and about 20%, and these are the people that have connections to Iran, who are also in bed with us, unfortunately, in a political sense, in the green zone, probably have a different view and would probably prefer to see some sort of partition.
Forgive me for this, but we're literally down to our last couple of minutes here, so I'm going to ask you a question that requires a half an hour to answer, and I'm going to ask you very unfairly to do it briefly. The big debate in the United States right now, of course, is whether to keep the troops there or bring them home right away. Where do you stand on it?
We've spent $1 trillion in the place. We simply can't afford to stay much longer. The American economy is almost comatose. I think it's going to be very difficult for us to maintain our position. I don't think that as long as we are on the ground in that country, that any legitimate government can emerge to rule it. And I always opposed any long-term occupation. I thought that we should, if we went in, go in and get out as quickly as possible without dismantling the state and the army. We made a very bad decision. We can't put this together again. We need to get out as soon as possible and let the Arabs on the ground sort it out. As we go out, we need to talk with and work with the other regional powers, but to be perfectly blunt at this stage, I'm not sure we're going to have much influence over what Iraq's neighbors do.
And are you supporting anybody for president? A lot of military people are.
You know, I'm not, and it's not because I don't think any of them are qualified. I think that those of us who served in the professional military for as long as I did, 28 years after a year at Virginia Military Institute and 4 years at West Point, we really need to stay out of these presidential races, and right now we need to be prepared to support whomever is elected, because whoever wins the White House confronts very serious problems indeed, economically, domestically, socially, politically here at home, and of course overseas. Our strategic position overseas has eroded dramatically.
Colonel Macgregor, good of you to join us on the line from Washington. Thanks so much.
Thank you for inviting me.